diverge from death and go to Geshe Lama Konchog's biography. I worked on this for several years and stopped about 10 years ago when his attendant told me to stop. I've asked him we can continue again because it's a very moving story, you'll see. So we'll read the first one. I'll read the first bit. The prologue. You all here? Yeah, okay. Okay. In the afternoon of an early spring day in 1965, the yak herder Pasang was climbing the mountains above his village, Bushi, not far away from the border of Tibet in northwest Nepal. Pasang was looking for his yaks, which he had sent out to pasture that morning. The mountains facing the north are extremely dry with very little grass. Following their tracks, he could see that they had gone further up than usual. He'd never been this far before. It was very rugged countryside and not easy to get to. Normally yaks are quite haphazard in their eating habits. Left alone, they graze here and there, gradually moving on and up. Tenzin Zopa's who's telling the story. I mean, I'm writing it, but it's his voice. And he's the main attendant of Geshe Lama Konchog. He's now a Geshe himself, and Geshe Lama Konchog's reincarnation is about 16, and he's in Serje monastery studying. Pasang crossed the waterfall and could see them not far away. Oh no, so they could go for miles in a day, eating their way into very dangerous situations. Many animals fall over the cliffs. Pasang crossed the waterfall and could see them not far away, grazing up the mountainside. He needed to find the lead yak so that he could herd them down. There were 10 of them. Show, show. You could hear that, the ladies, the people guarding, you hear them say, show, show, to the yaks. Come, come, he shouted. Maybe go, go, who knows. Then he noticed just above the yaks a person. He wasn't even sure it was a person, sitting in a hole in the rock face. He squinted his eyes and took a careful look to make sure he wasn't imagining things. He didn't know what to think. The person seemed to be naked and huge. There were caves up there, and one of them, the Cave of the Doves, is famous for being the home 900 years earlier of the great Milarepa. But no one ever lived there now, not these days. Pasang thought to himself, who knew who this was? Who knew who this was? He wondered if it was a yeti. In the mountains there's a strong belief in the existence of these mythical creatures, said to look a bit like gorillas. Or it could even be a demon. If it's a man, he must be crazy. What's he doing up there on his own in the middle of nowhere? Pasang was alone. It was getting dark, and the clouds were speeding across the sky, concealing the top of the mountains. He was scared. He gathered his yaks and got out of there. Back at Bushi, the villagers decided that they had to get rid of this intruder. Whoever he was, they didn't feel good about him. They were genuinely fearful that he would bring harm to the village. The next day, Pasang led 2 of his friends up the mountain to check out this apparition, armed with their slingshots. Up there, do you see him? He said. They shot several rocks at the figure, hoping to scare him away. The next thing they saw was this person carrying a small pack on his back, rushing out of the cave and almost flying up the mountain, hardly touching the ground as he went. They couldn't believe their eyes. But they were relieved. Now he was gone. 18 months later, one early winter afternoon, the old monk Rinchen Wangchuk was returning to his tiny house in Ganden Mountain, a 4-hour walk west of the Cave of the Doves, where he lived in meditation. He'd made the house from rocks years ago and spent the winters here, coming down from Mugompa, his monastery further up the mountain. Now that he was old, he wanted to spend all his time in his little hut in solitary retreat. He could have found a suitable place near his monastery. It's on one of the highest peaks and one of the most isolated places in the region. But he knew that Ganden Mountain was blessed by the energy of the Buddhas Vajrayogini and Hayagriva, and always the best place to meditate is a place that has been blessed by the presence of the holy beings. And of course, the great Milarepa had placed his holy feet on these mountains hundreds of years before. He had a close relationship with the people of Chokangpa, one of the nearby villages where he was born. From his hut he would visit his relatives for tsampa, roasted barley flour, and the other supplies, and of course to perform prayers for them. He was happy in his retreat place, isolated from the village and in sight of no one. But in the early winter of 1966 he found that he had a neighbour. It was late afternoon. He was returning from the village with supplies, but for some reason he took a different route, one he'd never used before. About 10 minutes from his hut, when he glanced over to the northeast, he noticed something moving among the rocks higher up. There seemed to be a person outside what looked like a cave, but a mist was rolling in so it wasn't clear. For more than a year, there'd been rumours circulating around the villages about a mysterious person, a madman perhaps, even a yeti, who had been chased away from the Cave of the Doves by the villagers of Bushi. Rinchen Wangchuk felt a bit anxious at first. He wasn't sure whether it was a person or indeed whether the fears of the villagers were based in reality. When you're in retreat, you want to be isolated, and he didn't know what to think about this new presence. Back at his hut, he couldn't get this stranger out of his mind. The very next morning, after his pre-dawn meditation session, he did some more investigating. He went to the spot from where he had seen the movement. He watched until the sun not only touched the cave, but was shining down on the village in the valley. But this time he didn't see any sign of life, nothing at all. He was reluctant to go there. It could be a yeti after all. Although probably irrational, he just wasn't sure. By now he was really curious. His mind was full of it all day. He couldn't even meditate well. Again, next morning he went to look. Again, nothing. This time he decided he'd go to the cave itself and find out once and for all. He made his way stealthily through the bushes, a 10-minute trek through the brush and up the mountain. He stood to the left of the cave, but because of the rocks in his path, he couldn't see inside. He crept closer, but still kept to the side, throwing a stone onto the rocky outcrop that formed the roof. 4 times he threw stones, but nothing happened. Then he crept around to the front of the cave and looked inside the doorway, a hole in the rock face. There was a man, almost naked, sitting unmoving in meditation. He seemed so powerful, huge, strong. Rinchen Wangchuk was amazed by his presence. Even though his hair was down his back and wild-looking, he could see that the meditator was a monk. He was wearing just a piece of his maroon robes covering his secret parts, with the rest of his body bare. His palms weren't in his lap in the usual meditation mudra, but open, each hand resting upwards on each knee, his thumbs curled inwards, resting in the palm. He had long, straggly whiskers hanging down either side of his mouth, but almost no hair on his upper lip or his chin. His face was dark and weather-beaten. The cave was bare, nothing at all, just this meditator sitting on a worn animal skin on the hard, rocky ground. Rinchen Wangchuk couldn't imagine how he could survive like this. And who was he? He decided this must be the person the Bushi villagers thought was a yeti, the person they'd chased away. He stood at the open doorway for a long time, just watching this amazing man meditate. But his mind was full of so many conflicting thoughts. Maybe he was crazy. How could someone live like this? And by the look of him, he could have been meditating for years. He, of course, knew all the stories about Milarepa, one of the most beloved and successful meditators of Tibetan history. Everyone knew them, how he'd left the world and gone to the mountains, moving from cave to cave, naked, living on nettles, and eventually gaining the supreme goal of enlightenment. His songs are known and loved by all Tibetans and their Nepalese Buddhist neighbours. Reading about this is one thing, but to see someone looking just like Milarepa would have looked, living in a bare cave for who knows how long, was something else. It was hard to believe. It seemed impossible. It was certainly the first time that Rinchen Wangchuk had witnessed such a yogi. Of course, he had received initiations himself into the highest practices during his time in Tibet, as well as locally. But seeing someone actually embodying the practice in such a radical way, that was not within his experience. He was also beginning to feel a little embarrassed. If this man really was a great meditator, how rude to disturb him like this, throwing stones. He decided to return to his hut. But the image of this yogi overwhelmed him during his own meditation sessions. He couldn't think of anything else. He began to feel very good about him, very safe somehow. He was drawn to him and wanted to get his own sessions finished quickly so that he could get back to the cave. On the 4th day after his mid-morning session, he went back. Again, there was the yogi in meditation. Nothing had changed since yesterday. He was absolutely still, unmoving, like a rock. Rinchen Wangchuk couldn't contain himself. He was compelled to talk to him. From the doorway he quietly said, "May I know who you are? May I offer you some food?" There was no reply, no acknowledgement, nothing. The meditator remained in samadhi. Rinchen Wangchuk was becoming convinced that he was a genuine practitioner, and he was yearning to connect with him. He longed to receive teachings from this holy being. Again he asked his questions, and again, but still nothing. He watched him for a long time, then left. He cooked his lunch and did his afternoon session, all the while thinking about the yogi who filled his mind. He couldn't wait to get back to the cave. On returning, he sat on the ground, just in front of the cave's entrance, with the afternoon sun at his back. He was but a few feet from the meditator, who was sitting opposite. His heart reached out to him. There was no sign of any food. He said very quietly, "You must eat food. I have food. May I offer you some?" No response. Clearly his efforts were getting him nowhere. Perhaps he was pushing too hard. Perhaps he'd better just leave him alone. But he couldn't let go of it. He had to meet this great yogi and receive his teachings. To receive personal instructions from someone who had direct experience of the practices was a rare and precious gift. He yearned for realizations himself and could not bear to turn away from this unbelievable opportunity. After a restless night, he returned to the cave as soon as he had finished his pre-dawn session, but this time he brought an offering, something auspicious. His small wooden bowl piled high with barley grain and a lump of salt. The grains for growth, expansion, and the salt when offered to a lama for the wealth of Dharma. The meditator was there as usual, naked, in samadhi. Rinchen Wangchuk knelt in front of him. Holding his gift high, he extended it towards him. Great Yogi, may this offering create a spiritual relationship between us. May I know who you are. Where are you from? This time the meditator opened his eyes and spoke. I am nobody. Leave me alone. His gaze was almost unbearable, powerful, piercing, steady. His voice was soft, but his words were firm. Rinchen Wangchuk's heart was pounding. He implored him, I am requesting you sincerely that you teach me the holy Dharma. It is not possible, the yogi replied. But nothing could stop Rinchen Wangchuk now. Whatever you demand of me, I am ready to follow. I will do exactly as you instruct. The yogi hadn't moved, his palms still resting upwards on his knees, his legs in full lotus position. After a long silence, he said, what you're wanting is harder than you can imagine. But I'm ready, I promise. Please teach me. I have lived at Mugompa for 40 years and I have studied in Tibet. Now I yearn to practice sincerely and gain realizations. I am trying my best to stay in solitary retreat, but I feel that I lack the blessings of the realized gurus. I'm convinced you must be a great yogi. I beg you to give me teachings. The yogi kept his gaze on the old monk bent low before him. If you follow me, you must stay in retreat for the rest of your life. If you can do that, I will give you initiations and the commentaries and guide you in your meditations. Rinchen Wangchuk was ecstatic, unbelievable. Like finding a treasure, he had found a lama, a true knowledge holder. At last he could achieve the purpose of his life, the realizations of the truth, just like all the holy beings of the past, stretching far back in time to Lord Buddha himself. But this must not go beyond us, the yogi cautioned. I have vowed to spend the rest of my life in solitary retreat, isolated from everyone. No one must know. I promise I will do exactly as you say. And now we go forward a few years. Not too many years, a couple of years. So this is the stories from Tenzin Zopa, who was one of 6 children, and two of his aunties were nuns. Okay, so we're coming now to this story. Chapter 2, the difference between earth and sky. So there's a bit of a background here. The monastery for the monks was called Mugompa, and then further up, 1,000 feet up from Parok, there was the nuns. You know, there was this monastery for nuns. So Ranchen Gompa is east of Parok and surrounded by all fours. Anyway, my great-uncle, Rinchen Wangchuk, this is Tenzin Zopa, my great-uncle, Rinchen Wangchuk, was one of the senior monks at Mugompa. When he was 60, in keeping with tradition, he was given permission to go off on his own into retreat. He'd already built his meditation hut where he used to go for the winter in Ganden Mountain. And in 1966, he decided to stay there full-time, which is when he met Meme Lama. So when he was very tiny, Tenzin Zopa met him first, and he just assumed it was his grandfather. He called him Meme Lama, Grandfather Lama. And he was living up in another cave. Well, no, this is the cave he was living in. Yeah, and then he eventually met this family. Tenzin Zopa was one of the family. And actually, Tenzin Zopa, chapter 1, the first chapter after the prologue, I asked Tenzin Zopa when I was interviewing him for this book, I said, when did you first meet Geshe Lama? He said, oh, when I came out of my mother's womb. So he said, the story is, he said, his mother was giving birth. She was one of these. And actually, again, by this time they'd known, by this time they've met Geshe Lama Konchog. They've known about him. Now, wait a minute, that's a bit confusing. Never mind, I'm getting you confused. I'll just read this chapter. Don't worry about it. Oh no, I'll tell you how he got born. He said he was in the womb, and apparently it was a problem, and the poor mother couldn't give birth. His legs were coming out first, so they called Genla. So Genla appeared. This is when they'd met him already. He was in his cave, but he came and looked after them. So suddenly Genla's there, and there's 2 aunties are there, the nuns, and they were trying to help the mother, their sister, to give birth to Tenzin Zopa. And then suddenly Genla said, go get some butter. So one of the nuns got the butter, and then he blew on it and blessed it and gave it to the mother and said, you eat this. So So she ate the butter. And then Tenzin Zopa said, then suddenly I went back into my mother's womb and I turned around and I came out and the butter was on my crown. What can you say? That's when he first met him, he said. So for years he thought it was his grandfather, Meme Lama. Okay, so anyway, it used to be the tradition in Tibet that every family would offer up at least one of their sons or daughters for ordination. Auntie Chodron, one of the nuns, this is one of his aunties, became a nun when she was 9 and went to live at Ranchen Gompa. For 3 years she served her old uncle Pasang Sering when he lived in a solitary retreat in a hut near Hayagriva holy place. She would carry supplies to him up the mountain. I'd just leave him at his door, she said. He was very strict in his retreat, which meant he wouldn't have any contact with people. But when her mother, my grandmother, died, when Auntie Chodron was 12, she was forced to go back home to work for the family. I was stuck for 10 years, she laughs. Okay, Meme Lama meets the villagers. Auntie Chodron vividly recalls the event that finally led to her freedom. It was the early winter of 1968. She was 23. Rinchen Wangchuk had invited 6 of the Mugompa senior monks and 4 of the senior Rachen nuns to perform the Tara practice at our house. Besides Rinchen, Wangchuk and me, there were the, this is Auntie Chodron talking, there were the monks, Pasang Tsering, a whole bunch of monks and a whole bunch of nuns, okay? We were sitting around the prayer room afterwards, drinking tea, when Rinchen Wangchuk told us he had something important to say. The real reason I asked you to gather here today is to announce that I have met a highly realized yogi up near Ganden Gompa. I've been receiving teachings from him for a couple of years. He said that in the beginning he had observed him closely and eventually gained great faith in this yogi. He is truly realized, truly qualified. I tell you, I have never met such a highly realized being in all my life. He is incredible. He made me vow not to tell anyone, but I'm sure he will understand when he sees how serious you all are. You must meet him. You must receive teachings and initiations from him. I chose all of you. You are the right people. You are ready for him. We were very excited, Auntie Chodron said. I felt so honoured to think that a holy being would be living so close to us. She said that Rinchen Wangchuk told them that this yogi was Tibetan, had studied at Sera, one of the 3 great monasteries, the Gelugpa monastery in Lhasa. This is where Lama Yeshe was, and this is Lama Zopa's monastery as well. Then after his escape in 1959, came to the Cave of the Doves and meditated in isolation. And he lived there without clothes, without food, without sleep. Can you believe it? Just like Milarepa. Auntie Chodron and the others were amazed. They knew about Milarepa, but to hear about a person living like that in their own time was hard to imagine. Rinchen Wangchuk told us, it seems that he is the so-called Yeti we all heard about. He is the one that Bushi villagers threw out. He's been there for nearly 6 years. He said he'd moved to some juniper trees after that, where he stayed for another year. After he got thrown out of that cave, he found all these just overhanging juniper branches, and so he made a cave under there. He lived in the bushes for 18 months, and they chucked him out of there as well. And then he came to this 3rd cave where he met him. So he is the one the Bushi villagers threw out. He'd been there for nearly 6 years. He said that he'd moved to some juniper trees after that, where he stayed for another year. They chased him away from there too, and he found his way to Ganden Mountain early in 1966. I met him a few months after that. He's been to many holy places in Tibet and India, yet he came here to caves near our village on the instructions of his guru, Trijang Rinpoche, the junior tutor of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We are so blessed. Rinchen Wangchuk told them that he himself had received many, many teachings and initiations from this yogi, and that it had a profound effect on his practice. He has given me the Vajrayogini initiation and an extensive commentary on the practice over several months. All his teachings are experiential. Just hearing his words, your heart is moved. He is such a holy being. Auntie Chodron said that she was deeply moved by Rinchen Wangchuk's words, and she felt so honoured. She could not believe her good fortune. She had been sincerely practising since she was a young girl. She had sacrificed her life as a nun to help her family, and now this amazing opportunity. He told us that we must keep silent about this. If we feel we are ready, we can go to see him tomorrow. And he said he'd confessed to him that he revealed his secret. They were all so excited. How fortunate we are. Such good karma we must have. Even though our village is so remote with few lamas, this yogi has come here. Thank you, Rinchen Wangchuk. We are so honoured. Auntie Chodron said that they all agreed they wanted to go to see the Lama the very next day. There was no time to waste. Rinchen Wangchuk had told us to bring a handful of offerings, whatever we want to give, to create auspiciousness. Next morning, she and the others woke up well before dawn. Most of the group had stayed over at the house, all squeezed into the prayer room. Rinchen Wangchuk instructed everyone to make very rich butter tea and to bring it in their flasks to offer it to the yogi. Auntie Churden also brought some butter, and she carefully wrapped the special porcelain cup we use for lamas. Some brought salt, others brought grain, and one had a woolen carpet, and they all had white offering scarves. They walked up the mountain together, the 11 of them, Rinchen Wangchuk and Pasang Tsering leading the way. The snow was on the ground, but not so heavily that the mountain was impassable. They were silent but excited, full of anticipation. They arrived exactly as the sun was reaching the cave, which was their plan. They felt this was very auspicious. When they arrived, the yogi was standing in front of the cave as if he knew they were coming. I was so nervous I was shaking, Auntie Churden remembers, and I was shocked at what I saw. He was huge, far bigger than any of us. His clothes were filthy, black almost, and they were rags. I could tell they were monks' robes, but it was just bits and pieces of robe. He wasn't wearing a monk's shirt, but just a bit of cloth wrapped around his shoulders. His hair was down his back, thick and matted, sticking out wildly. His face was very wrinkled and rough. She said he looked worse than the poorest beggar she had ever seen. She could not believe that this was a holy being. He stood there, his presence so powerful, so calm and deep, saying nothing. All the lamas I'd met before seemed clean and poised. They would smile nicely to greet you and say sweet words. This man just stood there, fierce, staring at us. I didn't know what to think. But he captured my heart right there, she said. I knew I couldn't escape from this person. He had me. But I honestly did not know whether I could cope with this. Rinchen Wangchuk introduced us. They are from Mugompa and Rachen Gompa. They would like to request initiations and teachings from you, great yogi, especially Vajrayogini. Please forgive me, but I decided I had to tell them about you. They all want the teaching so badly. They are ready. They are sincere. We were all bent low, looking down, too scared to meet his face, Auntie Churden said. Then he spoke. Since you have a monastery, why did you come here? He was so blunt, so direct. None of us said anything. Luckily, Rinchen Wangchuk spoke for us. They sincerely want to follow you exactly as I have done, and they have promised that the word will not get out. He stood there, silent, it seems for ages, Auntie Churden said. Then he spoke, strongly, clearly. If you dedicate your entire life to practice without breaking your commitments for even one day, I will accept your request. My heart was beating fast. I was so happy, Auntie Churden said. He asked us if we had all received a highest yoga tantra initiation. If you haven't, I can't give you Vajrayogini. Rinchen Wangchuk told him that we'd all received the right initiations. They're all qualified. The yogi invited them to sit down. They prostrated 3 times, each making their offerings, and then sat down on the ground, squashed tight together in the small space. I unwrapped the porcelain cup, Auntie Churden said, and held it out for each person to pour some tea into it from their flasks. I then offered it to the yogi. He led the blessing, chanting the nectar offering prayer to Vajrayogini. He sat there, serious, drinking his tea, but very sweet, humble, and very relaxed, Auntie Churden said. By now we had relaxed a bit too. Rinchen Wangchuk requested the yogi to let everyone have a sip of his tea for a blessing. He allowed us, Auntie Churden remembered. And then the yogi said, we have created a very auspicious connection. We dedicate this to liberation in this one lifetime. Now you can go, and I will tell Rinchen Wangchuk when the initiation will be. Auntie Churden told me that one of the nuns, young Don, was especially delighted. She knew the yogi. She didn't say a word when they were there in the cave, but she told the others later. He had come to her family's house years ago when she was a young girl. It must have been in May 1959, the year many Tibetans had escaped from their country. Of course, he looked very different then, but he was unmistakable, she said. I was carrying water back from Khumbu, and I noticed this big monk walking towards my house. He came to the front door and he called out, "Hey, anyone here?" My mother invited him in and offered him roasted barley flour. He asked if he could keep his things at our home. I only have some texts, nothing for you to worry about, he told her. There was a fatherly feeling about him. I thought how nice it would be to have him stay with us. I could just spend time with him, but he left. My mother really took care of that bag of his, which she kept in our prayer room. A couple of months later, she told them, she was again returning from Khumbu with water when some kids called out to her, "There's a big Tibetan monk in your house." I knew it was him and I was so happy. I ran all the way back. Amma, is it the big Tibetan monk?" "Yes, but he's already taken his things and left." I experienced such a feeling of loss. I ran in the direction that I'd seen him coming from earlier to try to find him. I looked towards the route to Tibet, but I couldn't see him. He was gone. The difference between earth and sky. The group started their retreat a few weeks later, on the 25th of the 11th Tibetan month, a special Vajrayogini day. Rinchen Wangchuk and Pasang Tsering had brought the various ritual implements and prepared the cave. The yogi looked just the same. He sat on a throne made of grass piled a foot high. The rest of them sat on grass that had been scattered to soften the hardness of the rock. He told them, "I have done the self-initiation, so now we can begin." The initiation took 3 days, followed by more than a week of teachings and practices. They all stayed at some nomad huts, a 15-minute walk away. First he recited the preliminary practices, the various prayers of refuge in the 3 jewels, expressions of bodhicitta, the aspiration to live for the sake of others, stopping and giving instructions each step of the way. The moment he started to teach, his words hit our hearts, Chödrön said. I was in tears. I had received Vajrayogini from other lamas, but the difference was like earth and sky. He gave the commentary on the practice every day until the 10th of the 12th month, 15 days later. We had 2 sessions of commentary every day, the first just after sunrise for 3 hours, then after lunch another session, another 3 hours. Sometimes they would sit around the cave together doing the practice. The yogi had to do his usual 4 sessions of meditation every day, as well as teach us. He seemed to be doing many different practices together. I could tell from his recitations that one of these was the Nyungne fasting retreat. They could also hear him recite all the major practices, Guhya Samaja, Yamantaka, Haruksha Chakra Samvara, as well as Vajrayogini. We could hear his powerful and beautiful chanting, but if he noticed that we were within earshot, he would chant quietly. He was so humble. This was the most special time of my life, Auntie Chödrön said. The 11 of us, whenever we saw each other in years to come, the first words out of our mouths would be to recall those incredible 2 weeks with our precious Lama. Without doubt, for every one of us, it was the most memorable, most meaningful, the happiest days of our lives. They all felt unbelievably proud and privileged, so special. Until the end of their lives, they always expressed this. The monks, when they passed away, they all died with very auspicious signs. They all kept their practice purely. They completed their great retreat for 3 years. They lived a life strictly following the Lama's advice. They died with confidence in their practice. Everyone in the village praised them. For all of them, she said, the yogi, my Meme Lama, became their main guru, their heart Lama, just naturally. You couldn't compare him with anyone else. His way of teaching was unbelievable. So we need one of them, I think, don't we? Yeah.
Do you know if that book will ever be completed?
Well, I mean, I worked on it for years, and then in 2007 he just told me to stop, so it's his book, even though I'm writing it, so I stopped. I saw him recently and I said, can we get going again? So I think I'm going to ask him again. The thing is, I got it up to where he came. It's from Tenzin Zopa's voice, from when he was tiny, and when he first knew him as his Meme Lama, then Genla went to Kathmandu, and then that's when Tenzin Zopa came when he was 7 or 8, and he became a monk, and so there was all these chapters about how he was at Kopan, how he first met Western students, and then there's a big chapter about how he left Tibet, how he studied in Tibet, and then that's it. And the last 20 years haven't been covered. I haven't done any of that research yet. So up to that point, it's all covered. It's like a complete book, really, like it is right now. But up to the last 20 years into his death, haven't done that part. So I suppose to complete... Pardon?
Is this the same story that they made that movie, The Unmistaken Child?
It would be similar because it's about him, yeah. Would be, must be, yeah. It's very interesting. I sent it to Wisdom to see if they were interested at the time. It was 10 years ago, and they said it was too childlike. They didn't like it. So whoever the editor who wrote it was, clearly wasn't moved by Guru devotion. And it is childlike. It's the voice of this boy, you know. You read the first one, there's a chapter about when he first knew him. It's like this, he's in love with this person, and then when he leaves, he's like devastated. So it is the voice of a child. It's very interesting. Anyway, it's very inspiring to hear these stories, I think. Yeah. So back to death, eh? What time is it? Okay. So, okay, where were we? I think death is definite at the time. Death is uncertain. And then the point about it, the action point is, given that my mind will continue, given that I don't want to have more suffering, then it follows logically right now, because I don't know when I'm going to die, I could die today, I should start practicing. It's like if I don't know when you don't know when your driving test is, they're going to call you at any minute, you better start being ready now. It's just logical, you know. And so we've got to use these tricks for our mind, because we're so bone lazy. Because we believe in permanence and think we're going to last forever, and then we have this worst level of, oh, I'll do it tomorrow, you know. So this gives this wake up. This is what the Atisha, his agenda is like this wake up call. Impermanence is a marvellous topic. You can hear it and think about it, and subtle impermanence is so fascinating, but it only hits home when you think of it in terms of death. And whose death? My death. So it's a wake-up call, that's the point. So then, then in this text that Tsongkhapa uses in his Lamrim, the next step that comes from this, just naturally, is then to think of the likely possibilities of the types of rebirth that we could have. So here we're taking the Buddhist model, obviously. So given that, we can, so then we think about the next topic in this kind of bullet points of practices to think about is to think about the suffering of the lower realms. And that's the one, of course, that's just so shocking to our minds. It feels so just kind of arcane, And especially when you hear the Tibetans teach it, it's like completely medieval, So the things I've never done all the meditations they talk about. I've never thought about the hell realms, never once. I don't think, not the way they talk in the text. For me, my mind, I want to try to understand how it's possible. So this idea, how our minds are conjoined with the four elements and how delusions create your cause, that I find very powerful in my mind. That gives me confidence, But as to sit and meditate on the hell realms, I've never done one of those. Have you?
Or just if somebody else is
Let it. No, I've never done. It was just ridiculous, It just didn't work for my mind. I didn't want to know about it. But anyway, whatever. The point is, though, but what I do find helpful is looking at animals. Because animals we can see. We can't see ghosts, we can't see hell beings, but we can see animals. They're right in front of us. So of course we've got our own view about animals, naturally. We've got the Western view, we've got the Christian view, here we've got the Buddhist view. So initially it sounds shocking, like you're criticising. Animals are stupid, animals have ignorance, animals suffer more, their minds are more deluded. It feels very heavy to us to hear that. But when we understand this Buddhist model of the mind and how we're all, this model of the mind refers to all sentient beings, all the way from the gods to the hells to the high beings in the form realms, all the way. It's this model that covers all sentient beings, which is a very interesting kind of holistic view, So if we think of this Buddhist view of having the delusions, ego grasping, attachment, and all the fears and dramas that come from that, we recognize those. And then we see in the humans, we also recognize love, compassion, wisdom, intelligence, kindness. And we know, and they're our saving grace. They're the human aspect of us. This other stuff are actually animal and lower realm tendencies. They're the tendencies of seriously suffering beings. So when we take that view, then we can identify with animals. And then and this is the point too, the more we understand our own mind, the more we know the pain of our own jealousy, the pain of our own pride, our own anger, our own attachment, then we can relate to other humans, and then equally we can see the suffering of animals in that way. Forget the grosser suffering. The grosser suffering, which is a really good way to meditate, to realise you don't want to be born like that, is to look at the way humans misuse animals, like domestic animals, just that level of suffering alone is very evident. So who would want to be born like that? The point of this contemplation is so that you think, I don't want to be born like that. It's to get, to increase your wake-up call. So that first level of suffering is very evident. Forget the wild animals, but just domestic animals. The way they're misused by humans, not to mention all the slaughtered for our food and everything. That's evident. Who would want to be born like that? Nobody with half a brain. But then you think of the subtle level, which is their minds. That's the one that's harder for us to see. And that's the one indicated by those words of Rinpoche's, So to try and imagine that, and then look at the suffering of that with the wish to think, I don't really want to be born like that. This is the whole idea, which of course is abstract for us. So this is the thing, I think I mentioned this, and I was very fascinating. We have all our own views about animals. So we think of wildlife. And indeed we are fascinated. All these movies about wild animals, all the wild. It's fascinating, amazing, amazing. But what's fascinating, like I mentioned, I remember on the same television show, there's this mummy lion stalking the buffalo for breakfast. So the way we see it is we just go, that's just the way lions are. And it is, it's the way lions are. We don't think of the causes of it. We don't think, what is that? What causes that? We think that's just they're born like that. It's natural, we say. And then we see her get the buffalo, so the camera comes up close. There's no sound because the microphone's away, but the camera comes up close, and you see the buffalo, and you see the buffalo's face. You see the eyes wide like plates, screaming in agony, evidently, while the lion, casually, brilliantly, with her clever body and clever claws and clever mind, rips its guts out for breakfast, and the children come and they have a leisurely hot breakfast. Now, we call that natural, and we call it the wildlife. Now, think about this. And then we bring the children in, and we call it education. Now, get your cat, bring in the mouse, bring in the children, sit them down, and get the cat to rip the guts out of the mouse and eat it for breakfast. You will be accused of abuse and put in prison, because the children will be screaming in fear, won't they? And that will be abuse. But we happily call it something different. We make this fantasy about it, is my opinion. We see it suffering. Because we call it natural, we therefore think it doesn't matter. It's just the way it is, we say. We honour that. It's natural. All the cameras come in close. The fish ripping each other. Fish, the way they live is unbelievable. Every fish is living in utter terror of a bigger fish. Every animal the same. But we say this is natural. Because it's natural, therefore it doesn't matter, we think. It's a fascinating view. Buddha's view is the absolute different. This is like living in hell. So, and then if you take the view that the mind is the same mind as the human mind, except they haven't got access to their virtue and intelligence, leopards can't change their spots, as we say, then you try and extrapolate that, and you imagine you waking up in the morning and the only option for breakfast that arises in your mind is to stalk your neighbour, get her by the throat, rip it out, rip her guts open, call the children, sit on the street and enjoy your breakfast. I think you would definitely think you've got a problem. Well, that's the lion. I mean, you understand my point? If the model of the mind's the same for all of us. So it's interesting to have different viewpoints, that's all. So what's interesting for us, isn't it? When we see humans doing bad things, look at the rage and the anger we have against them. Look at that. But that's natural too. What's the difference? What's natural mean? For Buddha, natural means you've done it that often that it's second nature. But we get angry at people. You don't get angry at the lion. But it's the same delusions, driven by their past karma, driven by their crazy habits. But we get angry. Evil monsters. Look at these evil monsters. We don't see the cause. So it's just interesting, different views, So the one about here is to think of what kind of rebirth. If given that our mind does continue and you want some rebirth, then what's the point of a rebirth? What's the point of it? What's the point? Is to have some wisdom so you can get the hell out of this mess. That's the Buddhist view. Get the hell out of this mess. And what you need to do that is intelligence, to put two and two together. In other words, understand a little bit about dependent arising, which is the way things exist. And to change and have the miracle of the ability to step back and analyze our mind and our behavior and make decisions to change. That's the point. So the one birth among all these six, the Buddha says, is the best of the bad lot, is the human one. It's not the fanciest rebirth. It's not the most suffering either, but at least we have access to intelligence. But now, look at the human planet. I mean, 99% of humans don't do that. 99% of humans act like animals. This is very shocking, but if we take this view and understand karma and look at the behavior of sentient beings, we can deduce logically that the vast majority of all humans on this planet, when they die, will be born in the lower realms. This is very shocking to hear, because we're driven by attachment. And because attachment seems so benign, we can't see how it's intense suffering, And attachment is the source of all the other dramas. Attachment is the source of anger, arrogance, harming others because of attachment. So to have access to some virtue, to have a miracle of conditions, and to even want to think about the meaning of life, to even want to think about being a better human being, not to mention have access to teachings and spiritual paths on this planet, that's pretty rare. So the Buddha would say it's not some accident. It wasn't given to us. We created the cause from our past practice. So how tragic to use this precious life. So we think, well, whom can I turn to give me methods that I can use right now to prevent me from getting a dumb rebirth and wasting this precious life. So the next step is we turn to the Buddha. And we take refuge in the Buddha. So who's the Buddha, What does that mean? Like we've been saying. This historical Buddha. But the general meaning of Buddha is this word. Buddha refers to the unmanifest, all-knowing, all-compassionate, all-pervasive consciousness. It's the potential of every living being naturally. So we've got this Mr. Shakyamuni, this prince back then, So that's the relative Buddha. And they talk about the ultimate Buddha, the absolute Buddha. That's this unmanifest, all-knowing consciousness. But out of compassion, manifests in bodies to help us. So we rely upon, we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the three jewels as they call it. Or Rinpoche with his incredible, polite, devoted way of putting it, the three rare sublime ones, he says. So there's the Buddha, absolute Buddha, relative Buddha. We rely upon the Dharma, which is Buddha's advice, Buddha's medicine. Absolute Dharma is the knowledge in the mind of the Buddhas and all the Arya beings, anybody who's realized emptiness on up. They're all the Arya beings, superior beings, whose minds have direct experiential knowledge of this stuff. They're the Rigsins, they're the knowledge holders. That knowledge in their minds is the absolute Dharma. But the relative Dharma is the words. That's what we need. We can't read the minds of these holy beings. Oh, it's the same as any knowledge. You know, Bach's mind, that's where real music exists, in his mind. We can't read his mind, so he kindly wrote it down. He puts little notations on a piece of paper so we can read it and learn it and become our Bach. Same with Buddha. The absolute Sangha, or spiritual community. Well, that's the Arya beings, all the great holy beings. And that could be like, Geshe Lama Konchog looked like an old beggar, the dirtiest beggar you'd ever see. And up there, they look 10 times worse than in Kathmandu. But there he was, a great yogi. So who can tell? So the relative Sangha is the monks and nuns. This is a big deal in Buddhism. The Buddha says that the presence in any one place of the existence of 4 fully ordained monks or nuns, living in the fullness of this body of knowledge of all Buddhist teachings called the Vinaya, all these rules of discipline, you know. So that anybody living in the fullness of these vows of a monk or nun, the presence in any one place of 4 of them is the criterion of the existence of the living Dharma in that place. So the actual Sangha is those holy beings. So that's the actual criterion of the existence of the Dharma. But for the Dharma to be existing in one place as a living thing, the Buddha would say that it needs to be 4 fully ordained people. And there's always this story you hear. In Tibet at some point there was some king who was killing off the Sangha, didn't like the Dharma, and they were running out of monks monks, but they never had full ordination for nuns in Tibet. It never got there, apparently. So they're running out of a quota. They needed 10 for an ordination or something. And they snuck over the border some Chinese monk. And they must have worn blue, because you hear that this thing here, this blue that we wear here, is out of respect and gratitude to that monk that kept the quota so they could have ordination, so they could keep ordination, that the Dharma alive in Tibet. That's how we hear the story. So that's the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, the 3 jewels as they call it. The one would rely upon, just how they say it. And then now we begin to practice. This prepares our mind. Thinking about impermanence, thinking about the lower realms, thinking about refuge. Now this prepares us. Now we start to take the advice, to take the medicine, abide by the laws of karma, back off and don't harm sentient beings. Bare minimum. Bare minimum. Back off and don't harm sentient beings. Then if you formalize your refuge, you take your formal refuge, then you could also at the same time, or maybe later, you could then formally take lay vows. Buddha loves his vows, like I told you. So these 5 vows. And the benefit of living in vows is said to be stupendous. The 24 hours a day, you've got them in your mind stream, even when you're not conscious of it. You're dropping these powerful, delicious, intentional, non-killing, non-lying, non-stealing seeds into your bank vault. Such that when you die, one of those can be triggered, which in our case did, to give us a perfect human rebirth. That's junior school. So the point that energizes us to even want to practice is this point of the Buddha, of our teachers, to get us to think about impermanence. The teachings are extensive. The teachings on subtle impermanence are really marvelous. They're really subtle. But the real one is the wake-up call. That's a teacher's agenda, to give us a wake-up call. Not want to waste this precious life that we work so hard to get. If we realize how much we must have worked to put together all the conditions that we've got now that we just take for granted, or we think, aren't we lucky, it would blow our minds, actually, how much virtue we must have created. Strong non-killing karma, practice in the context of keeping vows of non-killing, Lama Zopa says, just to get the human body. Immense generosity that enables us to be what somebody told me it's like 2% of the planet have enough conditions to live. to have enough time that we can be in a thing like this, to have the leisure, not to have to work 24 hours a day to get a bowl of rice. That's due to generosity. Then all the other conditions, to have, reasonable family who treat us nicely, people who believe in us, who like us, who speak the truth to us, banks who give us credit, all these other conditions that make our life like a miracle if we compare with most humans. This is the fruit of our own virtue and our strong aspirations in past life to want to continue to practice a spiritual path. It's not an accident that we're here together, Doesn't mean we'll all become a Buddhist, but at least we're thinking of these things. This is due to our own past virtue. So we should be delighted, not take it for granted. Not just thank someone else as a gift. If you have faith in God, that's fine. Thank him for it. But no one to thank here except yourself. Which means you don't want to waste your hard work. When you look at your veggie garden full of delicious vegetables, you never forget that you planted them, ever. You never would waste them. You would never waste those veggies. You wouldn't just greedily eat them all up, feeling on this arrogance of entitlement. You would know that it's the result of your hard works. So you'll eat the veggies, appreciating your hard work, but you'll quickly grow more. That's the attitude to have with life. What we've got now is the fruit of unbelievable virtue. So you would never want to waste it, to sit on your laurels. It's so arrogant. You'd want to create more. So when you do die, which could be today, you can die with a happy mind and keep on bopping because you've planned your future. You've sown the right seeds. You're in charge. You're the boss. And it's remembering impermanence every day is such a powerful technique to loosen the grip of ego, because you get more balanced, more reasonable. You appreciate more what you've got. If it goes, you're not going to break your heart. You go with the flow more. It's very powerful, just beginning to get impermanence. It's so beneficial. Not to forget it, Things change. One of the big things is we tend to think, like the Nicole example, you think, well, if he's going to leave me tomorrow, why bother? That's how we really think. We feel we have to think we'll be together at 80, otherwise you're not going to commit yourself. No, it's not like that at all. I mean, this event we're doing is 15 days, right? We know it's only 15 days. But we don't say, oh, it's only 15 days, why bother? No, you appreciate it all the more because you don't want to waste it. That really makes sense. When we know it's impermanent. We've only got 15 days. Or you go away for a holiday for a divine 2 days at a divine hotel. You don't say, I won't bother going away just for 2 days. It's not forever. No, it's only 2 days. And because it's only 2 days, you'll even enjoy it more. Because if you think it's permanent, I always tell this story. I always remember when I went to one time when I was living in Land of Medicine Buddha in California, in the northern California, where they have all the redwoods. And I don't mind, like I say, I joke about trees. I'm happy the trees are there, but I don't want to see them. I mean, they were so big they hid the sky, They were all dripping and wet in the winter. I didn't like it at all. These big fat trees, you look up. I'd rather have the sky any day. Anyway, whatever. One time I do these editing retreats sometimes, and someone had offered me, there's a little centre in Puerto Rico, this little tiny island. The Americans bought it, strategic, in the middle of the ocean. They bought it 100 years ago, didn't they? Americans. They did, they bought it, literally bought it. Like they bought Alaska, to protect themselves from all these enemies everywhere. Anyway, it's kind of renowned to be one of the happiest people on earth, the Puerto Ricans. It's so fascinating. About 4 million people, little baby island. And it's got this lovely winter. So in the miserable, wet, dripping winter in California, in the north, I went to Puerto Rico, and there's a centre there. Young Swimmer's got a centre. And so she found me this little place on the south coast. It's very tiny. And it was this lovely resort with pink painted buildings and the beach a minute away. It was like my idea of heaven. The beach, I like the beach, you see. So I remember spending the winter there. I had 9 weeks. And this is my example. I had 9 weeks. And I knew, I'm just talking samsara here. I was editing this book. Actually, that's what I was doing. I was editing this book. And I remember I was so happy to have this 9 weeks. I was so in heaven. So when I remember I bought this piece of pink, that squashy material that you make bathers out of. What's it called? Like spandex. It stretches. That one. And I bought this big pink, and I wore it like a sarong. I thought, no one's going to know I'm a Buddhist nun. I thought they probably thought I had cancer, But they all knew I was a Buddhist nun. They always go like this to me, Anyway, I lived the whole 9 weeks in my pink sarong. I'd swim in my pink sarong, and I'd edit in my pink sarong, and I'd lie in the sun in my pink sarong. I'd go for walks in my pink sarong. I was so happy, so lovely. But the point is this, I had 9 weeks. And every time I look at the calendar, 1 day less, I'd get anxious because I'm not using it, But so you imagine if you forget that it's only 9 weeks, you imagine it's permanent. I'm here forever. Then you wake up one morning, oh, I'm so bored, I'll do it all tomorrow. Before you know it, Rita, the agent, would be dragging me out screaming, time is up. But because I knew it was impermanent, you use it all the more. That's the point. I never wasted a single day. I'd swim, I'd go for the restaurants. You know, I did my editing too. I was a good girl. And so imagine if you forgot it was impermanent. I'd start getting attached to this place as my place. I'd sue the next door neighbours because they had this loud music. When you know it's only impermanent, you go, oh, it's okay, it'll all pass. It's only impermanent. It's very powerful to see things are impermanent. And you'll use it all the more. You'll appreciate it all the more. But we take things for granted. Taking things for granted is seeing them as permanent and seeing them as inherent. And it's arrogant, you know. And it's laziness. Can't be bothered. I'll do it tomorrow. Can't be bothered. Well, tomorrow doesn't come. And then the point is this. Sounds very hilarious. This is what I really got from working on Lama Zopa's death book. What, in fact, as a Buddhist, what you're actually preparing for is not death. You're preparing for the next life. It sort of dawned on me. I mean, they've been telling me this for 40 years, these lamas. I went, oh, I got it, you know. And that shifts everything. Think about this. In other words, that analogy of my, 9 weeks in Puerto Rico, if you think you're preparing to leave, then you pack your bags and you stand on the doorstep and the door's closed and then you go, well, now what? So what's the point of preparing for death? You're preparing for where you go after death. That is the Buddha's view. It's the Christian view too. You're preparing to go to heaven, you know. So that shifts everything. If you take this view, it shifts everything. So death is just this inconvenient, bloody, boring thing that's got to happen to get you to the next life. So death is not the point really. Living your life well is the point, and sowing the seeds and making your plans. Like if I had to go when I went to Puerto Rico, I had to decide where I was going, but I had to decide where I was going after Puerto Rico. So I had to have an air ticket. First I have to know where I'm going. So I had to get an air ticket to get to Puerto Rico. I knew how long I was going. And then when Rita closed the door and took the key and I walked out with my bag, now where? Well, I knew I was going to Boston. 10 below in Boston. I was not very excited. But I at least had a ticket. I had a plan. It's exactly the same here. I know it sounds so hilarious. But that's the view of being a Buddhist, if you're taking it seriously. And because you don't know when the plane's going, it's like you're on the waiting list. What do you call? You're on standby. So your bag's got to be packed, ready to go. And then you're out of here. Then you're sort of, death is okay because you're not just preparing for death. The death is a crucial period in which you make this transition. So you've got to do it well. You need to be helped through this, navigate this situation. But once you think of it like that, you think of the view of karma, you think of a future life, and you think of all the options. What one do I want? Well, it's pretty no-brainer. Human's about the best one. So then you check, well, what are the conditions I need? What do I have to do to prepare to get a human body? You practice morality. You don't kill, don't lie, don't steal. You practice generosity. You practice all the other virtues. They're the cause of getting a human body and a human life. Not complicated. So you prepare yourself by doing that. Then you've got your air ticket, everything's organised, you're packed, ready to go. You say, bye, I'm out of here, see you next life. Gone. Then you get a new mummy, decent one. I know it sounds like ridiculous, but it's the Buddhist view. And I'm trying to live that life. I'm trying to live it like that, so then make it real for me, So it all falls into place, the logic of it. So it's interesting. Remember what I said, and I'd never heard this before, I was quite shocked. But it makes sense. Because so much fear at the time of death, and after lunch we'll go into the death process, because there's so much fear for most people, because we don't think about death, we don't think about planning for the future, because we don't think we do, we don't think it's not our job, we don't think it's our job to do that. So he said one of the key things, given that we've got such attachment, we have got incredible attachment. And at the time of death, and it's in this book too, and it's the presentation of the 12 links of dependent arising, one of Buddha's sutras. And in there's this description of these different steps that we go through every second, creating new future rebirths. But there's a particular way of presenting these 12 links in relation to death. So there's a chapter in the book. So at the 8th and 9th, at the time of death, they're really extra intense levels of grasping, of really powerful attachment, kind of pop up out of the blue, unexpectedly, at the time of death. And this is why it is so much fear right at the time you start to breathe, stop breathing. Before you stop breathing, death's described in 8 stages, and about the second or third point is when this particularly powerful grasping kicks in, which causes you to hold on desperately. To this. That's the trigger that opens up your ATM machine, and out comes the karmic seed that'll be the one that'll send you to the next life. That's about then, and this grasping is the main trigger, is the main catalyst that determines the seed that's planted. So as I said, not only at the time of our past death, must we have had strong morality, which gives us the human body. Not only did we have strong generosity, which caused us to get a decent human birth with decent conditions, but we must also have had very strong grasping for a human birth. So he says you can use the attachment. So a Christian, for example, you know, attachment works in many ways, like we've been discussing. So one part of attachment is frantically holding on to this, not letting go. That's attachment. But another part of attachment, like we've discussed, is looking forward to something. So, you know, it's like tricking a child who won't hold on, who doesn't let go of this thing in this hand, but you give them a piece in that hand, so they forget this one, they drop, and the attachment goes to this one. So at death, we've got to trick ourselves into this, that we use our attachment to look forward to a perfect human rebirth. And I remember a person reading it and said, Rinpoche can't have said that. That sounds like delusions. You're not supposed to have attachment. But the logic is, given that we've got attachment until we're highly advanced, on the Mahayana path especially, you can utilize it. You can use the attachment. At least use it to look forward to a decent human body. And that can help the mind. So a Christian would look forward to being in heaven with God. Their mind will be, therefore, the point of that is this. The point of it is this, that would then make their mind happy. They would relax and let go of this and look forward to something. And it's a skillful means for the mind so that you would die with a happy mind, so the virtuous karmic seed is able to be triggered. So it's kind of skillful means. Where? Yes, sweetheart. Lunchtime. Yep.
Real quick,
Go, yes.
is there some place in between human rebirth and Helga? I mean, I don't know. There's something.
Yeah, animals and spirits, like I said. Animals and spirits. Animals and spirits. Animals and spirits.
I'm thinking of something else, so maybe I'll be able to pinpoint it.
Huh? What do you mean, darling?
I want to call it purgatory, but I know.
Oh, no, okay, darling. No, you're not. No, you're not meaning. That's not your question. Then your question is, what happens between this life and the next life? Is there that is called the bardo, or the intermediate state, which the Christians would call purgatory? I think is maybe the view of the Christian yogis. It's a place where you kind of got to finish up your messy stuff. But for the Buddhist view, it's called the intermediate state. We're going to go through that later, when you die, and it can last for a second, because if your mummy and daddy hop into bed, you've got no time to waste, you have to rush to get your new rebirth. But if they're kind of hanging around because they're not dropped to bed yet, so you've got to hang out in this kind of, it's like a dream state basically. It's the same as the subtle mind. We'll go into that later. It's called the intermediate state, or the bardo. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Time for lunch. All right, so discuss all this stuff if you feel like it. Or emptiness for that matter, since yesterday, isn't it? So again, let's think of our lunch. The work of all these sentient beings, one part, and the other part is it's got no inherent nature. It's labeled by our mind. We give it that meaning, and then we forget that we do that, and we think the meaning comes from the food, so then we get all greedy for it. But we made it up. We give it all that power, and we become attached to it, and then believe that it'll give us all this delicious pleasure. And then we get disappointed when we get too full, or disappointed when it doesn't taste so well. So it's all coming from our mind. Our mind is this brilliant creator of all this stuff. So on the one hand, there is food there that's done by others. On the other hand, it's our mind seeing it. So apply the emptiness and apply the compassion. We're going to eat this delicious food. All these kind people have cooked for us. So we stay healthy, so we can continue to practice. So we can repay their kindness and everybody else. And then we think of offering it as well. Think of it as big as the universe. We think of all the gurus and all the Buddhas and all the bodhisattvas and all the suffering sentient beings pervading space, and they're all experiencing the joy of receiving this delicious nectar, which we, if we could, we would happily offer. Lama Sangye Lama Che, Dejen Lama Gedon Te, Kongi Jepon Lama Te, Lama Namla Che Pa Bul. And then enjoy your lunch. And see you at 3:30.